Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. If the introduction sounds a little bit different to you, it's because it is. We've rebranded from Total Tactics FPL to FPL Fran. Since immersing myself with FPL, I just felt like it was a change that I wanted to make, at least within the last year. And you all know me as Fran anyways, so I think it's a great rebrand in a sense to shorten the name and also just show my focus towards FPL. As far as the Game Week 29 cheat sheet, which is this week's video, let's start with the budget midfielders. Benrahma is someone that I've added to the cheat sheet, and he serves a purpose alongside his teammate Bowen in that they paper off free hit 32 very well. So let's say if you don't have the free hit, then West Ham assets for me are fantastic to go for this week, alongside maybe even some Leicester assets that you might be considering. Benrahma is on penalties. He doesn't have exactly the best underlying stats, and West Ham have actually been a team that have been severely unclinical this season. Not to mention that individually, a lot of players have dropped off in terms of their underlying stats. So Bowen is one that is included. And you could argue that he's, of course, not worth his price. But the fixture run is very, very strong. I mean, ultimately, getting to play Southampton and Fulham over the next 2 weeks and then getting game week 32 Bournemouth is a great set of fixtures to really look at and target West Ham. But I can understand why people might be reticent towards going West Ham. But once again, of course, this is dependent on if you don't have a free hit, because I feel like that's what makes West Ham assets really strong. You'll also notice that I will rate Man United assets really highly. So, of course, you need to look at your own chip strategy, where you're planning to free hit, whether it's 32 and 34, and make those decisions. Because let's say if you're free hitting on 32, you don't really have to even worry about those fixtures whatsoever. So, therefore, the strength of, let's say, a West Ham asset isn't going to be so high in that fixture where let's say United blank. So that's what you have to look out for. Almiron is someone who drops. He had an injury prior to the international break. I think there might be a strong chance that he'll be back in action, but we don't know when. And of course, the matchup is very hard. First of all, in the first game versus West Ham, or Man United rather, and then having West Ham away from home. So it's not exactly the best fixtures for Almiron. It seems very sensible actually to go to Almiron last week prior to the injury news, because he had showcased a great performance as a substitute and probably was going to reassume his starting position. But with the injury, it sort of just throws that out of the equation. Ouattara and Billing, these are both assets that are worth looking into if you really want to go differential. I have to say that the simple reality is these Brighton midfielders are so strong and so cheap in similar price territories that it really isn't an option for me to go for players like Billing and Ouattara. But if you want to go a little bit left field, you can go for that, because Fulham, Brighton, Leicester are still great fixtures to capture a short little game week run here with Bournemouth assets. And of course, a lot of people will be using Solanke as a make weight, which we'll talk about in the forward positions. As far as 6.0 to 6.9, no changes there. 7.0 to 7.9, Gakpo has been reintroduced to the cheat sheet. This is simply because we are finally getting a lot of doubles closely with Liverpool, one in game week 34 and then one here with game week 29, which I actually think is a very, very tough double game week. It's not one that I really prefer for Liverpool attackers, if I'm being honest, or even Liverpool defenders, but ultimately they still have a lot of fixtures. However, it's still going to be Arsenal in game week 30, so not exactly one where I'd really consider Gakpo as a serious asset. And for Odegaard, I feel like because so many players have great fixtures in the midfield around game weeks 29 to 34, Odegaard is one who has to drop, because you're probably going to be thinking about looking at someone like Maddison, who just simply has more fixtures, some great matchups just in that short term three match run with Crystal Palace, Aston Villa, and Bournemouth. But also, if you look at assets like Bowen, more fixtures as well. And if you look at the United assets, particularly if you're equipped with a free hit, then it's just a superior move to go to players like Fernandes this week. As far as Saka, Maddison, those players are going to be nailed. And Maddison was more of a transfer last week for game week 28, but still, I mean, when you're looking at the fixtures this week, I wouldn't even be upset with someone going for Maddison captaincy, because the matchups are actually very, very good on paper for this Leicester team. Maddison managed to actually play in the international break without getting injured, so that's a positive sign, and you're probably likely to see Maddison do extremely well. And then, of course, he's got Bournemouth in game week 30. So Maddison is still one I would think about, particularly if I didn't have a free hit. I'd probably go towards him over Bowen in terms of my scheduling of priorities. As far as Salah, though, he also rises towards the top in the 9.0 plus tier, alongside Fernandes, who was already put there in the previous week. For me, Salah is someone who is worth looking into, but I still prioritize Fernandes in my way of thinking. And this is entirely dependent on whether you have a free hit or not, plus also whether you have enough money in the bank to go towards Haaland with whatever moves you plan to make. A lot of people are thinking to keep Saka Now, I don't think Saka has the best fixtures in the world, but he's probably the one Arsenal asset that I would like to keep in my team if I was going to keep one. And therefore, with Odegaard and Martinelli being worse options, in my view at least, then Salah is someone who you could squeeze into the team, but that would completely kill your budget. So if you go out of Saka, then it does make sense to go to Salah, but I'd still prefer Fernandes, as I said, as long as you're equipped with that free hit and you're planning to use it in 32. If we move towards the forwards now, what we'll see, of course, is that Isak has risen towards the top, and that's because we just got more information with Isak, really confirming that his status in the team is really positive. We saw Wilson pretty much sit out for 90 minutes versus Nottingham Forest. Isak taking penalties is huge. That was something that he already did do previously in the season, but him actually being the starter, still displacing Wilson, not even really sharing the minutes with Wilson because he's now fit, is a huge game changer for FPL. And I do think if, let's say, the game week 31 double game week was on, a lot of people would have made this transfer from Tony to Isak this week. However, we're probably going to delay that transfer because there's still tough matchups here and there, right? You've got ultimately United, and even the West Ham game will be a little bit tough because that's away from home. Brentford and Tottenham, still tough matches. So it does make sense to go Isak maybe a little bit later. I think he is going to be one that will be replacing Watkins in our team structures. So that's kind of how I see things, particularly if you're going to go out of Tony into Haaland. And you'll see, of course, that I've dropped Tony for the very, very same reason, that we are expecting him to either get 10 yellow cards soon or have this hearing create a suspension through, non-footballing related reasons, or rather non sort of like on pitch reasons. As far as João Felix, he is someone who I re-rated a little bit higher in the previous week. For me, he still pales in comparison to Havertz. What you can see is that Havertz is still the penalty taker of the team, so he's going to get a huge benefit there. And there's just much more certainty with Havertz's minutes. Whereas with Felix, I feel like what we've seen recently is that there are games where he can play 85, 90 minutes, but you will still see him get subbed off earlier. So if I wanted to play with security and with safety, I prefer Havertz. Now, of course, Felix is someone a little bit more interesting to the eye, I suppose, for most. The underlying stats are very, very close between them, specifically in this run where they've moved into the 3-4-3 structure. The expected goals per 90 are actually very, very similar, whereas Felix has been superior to Havertz prior to that run. As far as Darwin, he's also a riser because Liverpool have a lot of fixtures. I prefer him to Gakpo, but keep in mind that Liverpool have Luis Diaz coming back and that Darwin has been playing in the left wing positions. I do think he's interchangeable in that he can play both that striker position at times and also play at left wing. So we'll have to see what Klopp actually does in terms of reintegrating someone like Luis Diaz into the lineup, because we've seen Jota come back in, but he hasn't really changed much in terms of, let's say, Gakpo and Darwin's minutes, if we're being completely honest. As far as the defender positions, we have Duncan Estupinian rising back towards the top, and that's simply because we've just come over that blank. We now have arguably the two best double game week matchups here of any team from a defensive point of view. You can see that the clean sheet odds are actually the best for Brighton to actually get one clean sheet within this game week. If you aggregate the odds, I think it's something like 62%, which is vastly superior to the rest. West Ham and Arsenal are close. And of course, Arsenal, what's interesting is they only have one game week themselves. However, Botman and Burn do fall alongside Schär as well, as you can see. The reason why I've actually dropped players like Botman and Burn and Schär is because we were initially expecting over the international break to get confirmation of Newcastle versus Brighton. And so a lot of the suggestions in previous weeks were to incorporate that in our transfer decision making. However, with that probably going to be scheduled towards the back end of the schedule, I would say that Newcastle defenders are not of a high priority. And on top of that, you now have Isak that you probably would like to prioritize if you were ever going to go triple Newcastle. So that also just naturally just reduces the strength of this Newcastle defense. I don't think their underlying numbers have been poor whatsoever. So when we talk about great defensive teams, Newcastle is certainly still above there. They were very lucky, of course, to get something like 12 clean sheets in a row. But we know that based on the underlying numbers, even though that they've conceded goals lately, that their expected goals conceded should suggest that they are going to be getting clean sheets again sometime soon. So Newcastle defense is not terrible, but they're just not the best compared to options like Duncan Estupinian. I would also probably asterisk Estupinian slightly. We did have some rather dampening comments on Estupinian and, let's say, De Zerbi's preference for utilizing him, but I do think he has upside as a player. Now, he's not going to take penalties like he does for his national team, but Estupinian is someone who gets really involved by cutting inside in the sort of tactical structure that they have, and he takes a lot of shots on target. So he is someone that I was actually quite scared of not owning when I moved into Steel in Game Week 27, and I still think he's a great asset. Now, of course, he could be rotated, but the same really applies to Mitoma and McAllister, and I still think that De Zerbi rates him higher than some of the other options that they have in their arsenal. Now, Dunk is the complete opposite of that because Brighton are still involved in the FA Cup, so there might be future rotation in the future. And with Dunk, you have someone who De Zerbi actually rates as one of the top 5 center backs in Europe, not to mention that he will just be nailed. So that's going to be the position between Dunk and Estupiñán. Now I'm starting to actually reprioritize Dunk in my transfer decision making for, let's say, general suggestions for people, because although there's some upside to Estupiñán, I still think that there is now some clear downside, and Dunk, it gets rid of that whilst giving you the safety of someone like Gabriel. Now, he's not been fantastic in the air, and I don't expect Dunk to score a sort of bullet header, but this is the position of FPL. It makes sense to actually keep these Brighton assets who have doubles in the future that will be nailed. So you don't really want to deal with maybe the risk of Estupiñán at this point in time, but I can understand managers who still want to tap into that. As far as Pedro Porro and Ben White, I've just put Ben White back into the yellow tier to match the drop of Gabriel and Zinchenko. When we look at these Arsenal fixtures, I have to say in the short term that they're probably worse from a clean sheets point of view, even though actually Arsenal are known to be a very, very good away from home team. One of the matchups, of course, is still Liverpool. And even though they have Southampton in Game Week 32, I'm assuming a little bit that a lot of people will be playing the free hit in 32. So therefore, the strength of owning an Arsenal asset has been somewhat diminished by a lot of people saving up their free hit for 32 specifically. And if you do find yourself in that scenario, then I would say Arsenal assets aren't a priority to keep this week. In fact, they're probably a transfer out. However, if you don't have a free hit, then there's no reason to sell your Arsenal assets. You'd probably be playing them in 31 and 32, all things considered. As far as Pedro Porro, he also rises because Emerson sustained an international break injury that actually will keep him out for around 4 to 6 weeks. That will continue to give Pedro Porro a lot of minutes, even though I have to say, as a Spaniard, that his performance in the second game in the national break was pretty dismaying. However, Spurs are going to stay in this back five structure. He is someone who is integrated and able to play in a back five, and he's probably got his best talents showcased there, whereas Spain played a back four. So that's the main issue. Tottenham, of course, have a new manager. We'll see how things go, but I don't see themselves moving away from a tactical structure of a back five. So for me, Pedro Porro is actually a rising asset. Also because he's more nailed. As far as Zuma, he's one to think about if you want to go for a West Ham asset. Their clean sheet odds are actually very, very high. I don't think that West Ham have been a very good defensive team this season, though. So let's say if we even take away the Game Week 29 fixtures, I just don't really like Zuma very much. And so that's just my little issue there. As far as Shaw, he's someone who actually rises in the cheat sheet. He is going to be one of the superior assets to get alongside Chilwell. Now that we have a little bit of confirmation, I would say that James might be rested and rotated, because even though James was pictured in training, I believe, although I can't confirm the date specifically of when he was in training, James is going to drop because if he was to have suffered an international break injury that he could have recovered from, there's still a high chance that Chelsea will rest and rotate him for maybe one of the fixtures, because there's going to be that overlap with the Champions League as well, which is something that they're still involved in and fighting on in terms of all fronts. As far as Alexander-Arnold, he's the one asset that I would think about actually going for if you actually have a lot of money in the bank and you don't really want to go out of your Arsenal midfielders. This is a scenario where I believe if you, let's say, want to keep Saka, Martinelli, and Odegaard, these sorts of assets, then maybe going for Trent could be a little bit of a differential play that can cover you off quite well. I'm not 100% fond of it because, look, the fixtures for Liverpool from a clean sheets point of view is actually quite poor. I actually think they could definitely get a clean sheet versus Chelsea, because Chelsea and Liverpool games somehow always tend to be 0-0. That's just pure bias, but the City and Arsenal games are frankly terrible. So I would not really consider owning Trent for this fixture run. I'd think about getting him a little bit later, maybe as soon as Game Week 31. And that's kind of the landscape of the defense. And that's very closely mimicked, arguably, by the goalkeeping landscape. I've added Alisson to the cheat sheet and dropped Raya and upgraded Steele, because Steele has such great clean sheet odds. Whereas with Raya, I've actually taken Henry and me out of consideration in the cheat sheet for defense, because the clean sheet opportunities here for Brighton and Man United, their two opponents seem to be very, very terrible. I don't really see chances for Raya to do well other than getting a lot of save points, which he has done in the past, even despite losing a clean sheet. But that makes him just superior to, let's say, the Brentford defenders, as opposed to a superior option compared to other keepers in this week. And then Iverson joins the cheat sheet actually because of him displacing Ward in the previous week. So he might be one to think about, but if you actually have budget, then Steele is someone that I would still think about first and foremost. And that's going to be the cheat sheet this week. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys shortly.